I didn't realize they put the flip phone over here. All right, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday at RSA. Thank you so much for coming to hear a little bit about the space system cybersecurity threat landscape and what we're doing across government and industry to address some of the unique challenges in the ecosystem. My name's Nick Leiserson. I am the Assistant National Cyber Director for Cyber Policy and Programs in the Office of the National Cyber Director at the White House. It's a very nice, long DC title, but it's got cyber in it 3 times, so I belong here. I'm joined by several of my colleagues from the interagency, as well as someone from industry. I'll introduce them in a minute. But before we get into what I hope will be a very lively discussion about the challenges and opportunities that we see in space, I just wanted to give a little bit of context of why we at the White House, because we got 2 White House officials on the stage here, care so much about this particular issue. I am a cyber guy. I am not a space guy at all. Thankfully, we have lots of space people here to help us navigate our way through this conversation. But it is a really, really interesting problem set. It's an interesting problem set technically. It's an interesting problem set strategically because of the way our adversaries are interested in targeting our space assets, and it's an interesting problem set from a policy-making standpoint as well. And those are kind of the contours of the discussion that we're going to have today, and hopefully have some time at the end for some questions and answers from you all. So to start, let me just quickly introduce our esteemed panelists here. So to my immediate right is Mika Ouyang, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for cyber policy at the DoD. She is the principal author of the recently released last year Defense Cyber Strategy. She oversees cyber operations at the Department of Defense, including offensive operations. Prior to that, she had a long-time career on the Hill, including staffing Senator Ted Kennedy as his military legislative assistant during the Iraq War, and also for this audience, while she was on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, she oversaw investigations from the congressional side into the Buckshot Yankee incident at DoD. To her right is Erin Miller, who is the Executive Director of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the Space ISAC. Erin has a history of working on rapid commercialization of technologies for warfighters, and she asked me to say she likes to build things from nothing, and she is going to bring an industry perspective into how we are addressing some of the challenges here. To her right is Tahara Dawkins, who is the Chief of Staff at the National Space Council in the White House, working for the Vice President of the United States. Prior to joining the White House in 2022, Tahara led the Commercial and Remote Sensing Regulatory Affairs Office at the Department of Commerce. And then finally, at the end, we have Manand Dalal, who is the Assistant Chief Information Officer who oversees cybersecurity oversight, the radio frequency spectrum, and pushing new technologies into NESDIS, which it's up there. I'm sorry. There are some Washington acronyms that I cannot just rattle off the top of my head, but the satellite arm of NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration that operates a good portion of our civil satellite fleet. He has been at NOAA for 20 years in a variety of different roles, and they all have very interesting perspectives to contribute to our conversation. So to start out, Tahara, I'm going to turn to you because you work at the National Space Council, and we got a lot of cyber folks in the office, right, me included, or in the room, me included, and it would be great to hear why the administration cares so much about space. What is the Space Council up to? What's happening in the broader space economy that makes this such a priority for the administration?
Yeah, so first it's an honor for me to be here to discuss space systems and cyber threats, so hello everyone. For those of you that do not know, the National Space Council is responsible for ensuring the United States capitalizes on the opportunities that are presented by our nation's space activities. And to do that, we provide the President with advice on the formation and implementation of space policies and strategy. The Space Council is chaired by Vice President Kamala Harris, and the council members includes heads of departments and agencies in the US government, including NOAA, NASA, Department of Defense, Department of Energy. There's a total of 19 departments and agencies on the council. This administration takes space extremely seriously. The president and the vice president have made it clear that space is a priority and has focused on the broader space economy, including efforts to enhance collaboration between government and industry, promote sustainability in space activities, and prioritize the technical innovations. Historically, space, the ecosystem has been driven by government and large defense contractors. However, today, newer companies and investors are entering the market and making commercial and government systems more integrated than ever. And so as the space economy expands, there's an emphasis on ensuring responsible space activities to maintain a safe and sustainable space environment.
Thanks, Sahara. And I think that commercial integration into government operations is a theme that I think we'll hear a lot about. But Manan, to turn to you, I've been on a bunch of policy panels this week, and one of the words that gets tossed around a lot is critical infrastructure, a Washington, D.C.ism if there ever was one. And in fact, we just released a new national security memorandum that the president signed out last week, setting critical infrastructure policy. Space systems are not a sector themselves, so one of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors that we identify, but they are critical infrastructure. And I would love to hear some of your perspectives from NOAA about the mission that you support and what it looks like from NOAA's perspective in terms of the functions that you all are providing for our country.
Yeah, thanks for having me, first of all. Like you, Nick, I'm also a cyber guy. I've been in IT industry all of my life. So when I joined NOAA specifically and my line office, space cybersecurity was a completely new arena for me. And let me tell you, there are a lot of similarities with the cybersecurity function that we do on IT on the ground side, and now adapting that to the space cyber as well. So what does it mean by national critical infrastructure at this point? So all of you today get your weather from your phone. All of that comes from some of the environmental observation satellites that NOAA operates. We not only provide the critical observations that go into the modeling that gives you the day-to-day forecast, what is the temperature going to be, what's the forecast, what's the hurricane, what is it going to do, the landfall. On top of that, satellites provide a very critical piece of communication interlink for the whole world, right? I mean, it's ubiquitous now that anybody who has a cell phone can connect to anybody else in the world. That is entirely made possible using communication with the satellites. GPS is another technology that we rely on a lot. Everybody has a GPS now on their cell phone, and that key functionality is really from the satellite technologies. And lastly, a lot of people may or may not know this, but solar observations also provide a very critical role in protection of our infrastructure. A solar flare, and this is sort of a thing that we have been talking a lot about lately. There was a Washington Post article on this yesterday as well. Solar events are becoming more and more problematic for us as we rely more and more on technologies that are space-based. So having those critical observations to give us a day, 2-day, 3-day early warnings on when a solar event is going to impact us is very critical. In my particular role, I manage not just the cybersecurity on the ground side, which is really the data processing component, the dissemination of information, and those types of things that in the IT world we are used to. From the space cyber component things, it's also the cybersecurity for the orbit instrumentation, encryption, the link between us and the spacecraft, and you can imagine a multitudes of scenarios where our adversaries are trying to get a hold of our critical infrastructure. So these are the types of challenges that we consider national security concerns, and this is what we mean by the critical asset.
Thanks very much. And I think we're going to turn to you, Mika, next to maybe take us from imagining to actually understanding what does the threat look like from our adversaries. Obviously, the title of our panel right up there, Securing Space Systems from Cyber Threats. So when you look from your perch at the Department of Defense across the threat landscape, what really stands out to you with respect to our space systems?
Yeah, we're seeing, since the war in Ukraine, I think this audience is well familiar with the Viasat hack. We're seeing nation states increasingly interested in their ability to disrupt space systems, to disrupt the communications of other nations, populations, militaries. And as we look at that threat, we have to look at it in 3 different ways. You have to look at the cyber risk to the ground segment, and that is a traditional cyber risk. You have to ensure that that is secure. You have to look at the cyber risk to the link segment. And that, when we talk about jamming and spoofing, right, you're talking about a different group of engineers who understand spectrum, RF, electronic warfare. And then when you're looking at the on-orbit assets, you're looking at a different environment in which you are, where you're doing your compute, your sensing, whatever, that is not quite the same as on the ground. And as we look at those, we see adversaries interested in trying to disrupt at all segments. But the easiest one for them to try and disrupt at is the ground segment. So the cybersecurity of the space systems, the ways in which the information from space flows across networks to enable traffic is something that we're very worried about. And so since we see so much, even for the Department of Defense, so many of these assets are commercial assets, we have to make sure that we are engaged in an ongoing information sharing relationship with industry to make sure that we understand what industry is seeing as their threats, and what kinds of TTPs they're seeing from actors, and then what we are seeing so that we can share with them actionable intelligence to be able to better secure those systems. And you guys, I think, are well aware, Morgan Adamski has been here, NSA Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, and the information sharing that they do to try and have that conversation with a specific space audience, in addition to others who are providing that network connectivity for those space systems. But we think that this is an area that's only going to grow, and the challenge for cybersecurity that we see is that it's going to require engineers who understand a variety of disciplines, not just the IT and the software layer, but also that interaction with the radio frequency, how to do authentication off of those channels. But then also when we look at the potential disruption to on-orbit, do they understand the unique engineering environment in which those on-orbit assets live, and understand the ways that disruptions can be detected or not, and how are we doing that? So as we look at that threat environment, we see it as a much more complicated threat environment even than the traditional cybersecurity environment, and encourage everybody to find a buddy who understands the rest of the infrastructure.
That's certainly what I try and do, because it's a puzzlement to me many of the times. I just want to foot stomp one thing that you said, right, which is how much we are concerned about ground systems as an access point in to disrupt space systems, because the ground systems often do look a lot more like what we're used to protecting day to day. And the fact that our adversaries really are interested in strategic disruption, Viasat, right as the Ukraine invasion was beginning, is really important to understand just the strategic landscape where we're at. But Mika mentioned, I think, the importance of sharing information with our industry partners, and thankfully we have Aaron here who is really one of the experts on that. So you've heard some reflections about how we think about space from a government standpoint, why it's important. Can you give a sense of what resonates from an industry perspective, particularly maybe on the threat side, and what you're seeing from the Space ISAC point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you to RSA in advance for this panel, because I mean, this is an incredibly important topic right now. Space system cybersecurity is affecting all of our livelihoods. So from an industry perspective, then what we did in 2019 at the request of the White House is we stood up a Space ISAC, Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, to share threat and vulnerability information across the space system. So as Mika mentioned, ground link and space vehicles themselves or other spacecraft are all part of the space system, and a collection of those owners of the critical infrastructure are the members of the Space ISAC. So in working with them, then we've been able to establish a watch center that's operational, and we share threat and vulnerability information associated with their biggest concerns. So it's a very member-driven environment, but it's also a public-private partnership where we take input in from public sector partners from actually around the world, and our members are from around the world as well. And we addressed the first threat scenarios based on what they told us were the highest priorities. So we achieved initial operational capability for our watch center by looking at nation-state actor activity and issuing out alerts related to those threats and activities. We also issue alerts about purposeful RF interference, maneuvers that are out of the normal pattern of life related to spacecraft. And then we also are heavily focused on cyber threat intel and enrichment, which I'm sure resonates with all of you. But how we get that to include the Security Operations Center and the Space Operations Center and all of those different types of data sets, turning that into actionable intelligence is our highest priority. So that's driven by industry desires and demands. We have a phase 2 of our watch center that's a whole nother list of all of the industry desires and demands for threat intelligence that maybe I won't go into, but supply chain is one of the biggest concerns. Space weather and how it interacts with RF interference is another concern, as well as space weather itself and the heightened situation that we're in right now with that. And I would say the growing cislunar infrastructure. So those are some of the priorities that industry has expressed at this time.
Great, thanks, Erin. And I think that dovetails nicely into the second area that I want to tackle, which is some of the challenges specific to operating with space systems. So let's get the NOAA perspective, because you guys operate satellites, and you're responsible on an operational level for making sure that they are providing vital data that are used every day in emergency management, for instance, and that we rely on. What are the challenges that you see, as you look across the whole spectrum of conventional IT systems that you have responsibility to, all the way up to the on-orbit assets? Like, what makes space particularly challenging? I think a lot of folks here have experience with operational technology and information technology, or information and communications technology, but space to me has always seemed like it's in the very upper echelons of degree of difficulty. So would love to hear some of your perspectives of
Yeah, absolutely. I think what people have to realize is there are at least three different orbits that NOAA's operational satellites work in. One is the geosynchronous orbit, which is 27,000 miles away from Earth. The other is the low Earth orbit, which is the polar orbiting satellites that provide a lot of microwave sounding type of data that goes directly into the NWP models. And then the third emerging sector is, as we talked about, the space weather, which there are two different orbits that we're looking, which is really between us and the sun. So imagine a spacecraft that's between us and the sun and providing constant look at the sun. So why is this important? Because once you launch the satellites and it's in orbit and it's operational, we can't send somebody up there to fix any issues. What that means is obsolescence become a big problem. If I have an IT problem on ground, I can send an engineer to replace the hardware, continuously refresh the technology. I can't do that easily with space technologies. Once it's launched, it's there. So why is that important when you're building some of these space systems with a duration of anywhere from 7 to 10 years? And NOAA has a really good history of managing some of these space assets for much longer than their initial lifetime that we are envisioning. That becomes a big issue. You have to create systems where you need to accommodate for a little bit of these technology changes. One recent example that I can give you, what happens when we're in post-quantum world? Well, our encryption systems on the space, I can't go up there and start mucking with them, right? So all of those things have to be considered. So it's a constant push between how much do we want to put on there that's sort of up and coming new technology, keeping in mind that some of the duration of the satellite missions are 10, 15 years. As the commercial sector is getting more and more involved, this is where I think it will become very contentious. And the commercial sector will take risks when it comes to some of these. For NOAA, because we are providing operational data that has national critical importance, how much of this do we want to accommodate into our risk-taking posture? Do we just say, okay, let's take some choice technologies and push it up there? Or do we say you want to take the most robust technology and send it out there. So this is where I think building for space ground is easy. I can make those changes. But if the space technologies are not able to accommodate the rapidly refreshing ground technologies, it becomes very difficult to manage.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it does not seem, it is not a small task that you have, so thank you. Aaron, would love to hear kind of reflections from industry on this challenge as well. What do you hear from your members that is keeping them up at night about specific challenges operationally in the space domain?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges that caused us to create the Space ISAC do still persist, which is that we need to break down the silos of information sharing between public and private sector. But there's also a large attack surface that is commercially owned and operated now. So I'm just going to throw out an estimate. It's probably around 90% is commercially owned and operated. And so with that being the case, then the commercial sector has a lot of information about threat intelligence, and we need to really activate as much as possible what I'll call lightweight threat information sharing. Those of you familiar with how cyber threat intel sharing takes place, then you know that it doesn't require tons of cloud space and cloud environment in order to share threat intelligence. We can do this in a very fast, effective manner, and so that's one of the concerns, is that we get the information out as fast as possible, and then we create awareness of the threat activity and provide actionable intelligence. I think industry wants to see more machine feeds that relate, machine-to-machine feeds that relate to the space layer. So not just the terrestrial layer and our traditional cyber threat intel sharing, but cyber threat intel sharing for space. And so we're actively working on that. We run a number of exercises, and so what we see during these exercises is that companies have a turning point. So if you're on a crisis action team and you are part of the space industry, then you will have a turning point in your exercise, if it's a Space ISAC exercise, where you realize you're now part of a geopolitical dynamic and how a company responds to that and how they coordinate with the rest of the world, the other agencies that are involved, and with their ISAC is pivotal to our success. And so we see that as a concern that industry has expressed, is that we need to be able to be responsive and trained on incident response for space systems. And a third one that I'll mention is overall awareness of the minimum cybersecurity standard for space systems and what the expectation is globally. There's a lot of conversations around the world on this topic, and so I find that incredibly encouraging that we are having that conversation and people are motivated to solve this problem and really set a bar for themselves so that we have something set in stone that we're supposed to achieve, but it's also malleable and we can continue to evolve the technology needed to address these different types of controls and standards and best practices.
Thanks. And so, we've heard some of the design challenges and operational challenges if you're trying to send something up into orbit. The challenges once you've got it there, and how do we make sure that we understand the threat landscape that's out there? But maybe Tahara, turning to you, what are the policy challenges that exist? I know our offices have worked very closely together in the White House. We held a joint space cybersecurity executive forum in March of last year, went out and did workshops around the country with industry. Over 125 companies participated to hear perspectives on how existing space policy is helpful and where gaps exist. But from your perspective, as someone from space looking at cybersecurity, what are the challenges that you see, and what have you heard as you've dove into this issue from the Space Council point of view?
So sure, I think it's kind of what Aaron was talking about. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see is that there's a lack of synchronization of cybersecurity requirements among the government sources in the United States. Currently, there's a highly fragmented landscape of cybersecurity requirements for commercial and government contracted space systems. And in the absence of consistent cybersecurity requirements, most companies are kind of doing their own interpretation at the design phase to put in, what they can from what they've read. So what's needed is, by and large, space industry needs the policymakers to establish the baseline requirements, which sounds easy enough, right? But it really isn't. As we start putting words to these policies. We have agencies like Defense that have these really high requirements because of what they're trying to protect, compared to what NASA or NOAA has, who wants to give away data freely, and to get synchronization within just those two industries, or even defense within defense, on what they're using data for, to agree on what those minimum requirements are for U.S. Commercial companies has been a little bit difficult. But we're finding our way through it. But it definitely is one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing today.
Yeah, we at the Office of the National Cyber Director released our posture report on the state of the cybersecurity posture of the country in 2023 on Tuesday. And when my boss, the National Cyber Director, presented it on stage on Tuesday, he said, the thing that is most important about why we're doing okay, even though there's a lot of work we still need to do, is because of partnerships. And I think that really underscores, Tahara, your point of we need to partner inside the government, inside the White House, but also with industry if we're going to see the successes we need. But Mika, one of the topics that we've really heard a lot of is challenges with commercial integration, or the explosion of commercial space. You and I both know about the cybersecurity challenges to our national security architecture. The challenges are very real. They're real enough that most of them we can't talk about in this room. But as the department and the intelligence community are increasingly relying on commercial services, what kind of cybersecurity challenges does that present for you all?
Yeah, so I think for those of you who are tracking, the department released a commercial space integration strategy recently. Historically, the department had sort of done its own space, defense industrial base, right, ULA, and sort of bespoke. But as we've seen more commercial providers coming into the space sector, the opportunities for space integration to try and gain some of those efficiencies have really increased. But that requires us to make sure that as we are looking at commercial space options, both for DoD platforms, but also for resiliency, we need to think about how those things interact with our existing systems. How do we integrate the commercial industry into our space architecture? And then how do we ensure that we are able to align our cybersecurity requirements and other requirements so that we are communicating clearly with folks about what we need? And some of that, because we're the Department of Defense, we can do via contract. We don't have to simply do via regulation. And you see that reflected in the strategy. And then how do we have that ongoing conversation with industry as we go forward? The commercial space integration strategy is set at a very high level, so a lot more detail to be worked out as we go forward through implementation, but it's setting out a broad direction for the department to be able to integrate more commercial space into our space architecture.
And I think that really reflects the themes you heard from Tahara at the beginning, right, of how space is being increasingly integrated into our economy, right, for purely commercial reasons, for critical infrastructure support, and also for national security. So this problem set is just going to keep increasing as time goes on, and it's going to occupy, I think, more mind share for those of us in the cybersecurity community. But we've been talking a lot about challenges, and as a policymaker, I'm very oriented to think about, okay, but what are we going to do about them? So maybe, Erin, let's start with you in terms of what are some of the solutions that you're seeing, and maybe the converse of the question I asked you earlier about what keeps you up at night. What helps you sleep better today? Where do we see the trend lines heading in the right direction?
This is a good question. Yeah. I started making notes to prepare to answer this question, and the list is so long. Like, the fact that we're even here having this conversation today, that's a great start. For all of you who are cybersecurity professionals who don't work in space yet, I want to tell you that there are tons of opportunities for you to get involved in cybersecurity for space systems, because we need more cybersecurity professionals thinking about protecting the space system in the way that we have for the last 25 years for our other critical infrastructure. And so overall, I would say I feel very positive, because everywhere I go in the world to have the conversation about space systems, cybersecurity, I find people who are thinking about this, and they're working on it, and they're a million times smarter than I am. They're informing policies, they're working with their commercial sector, and they're expecting great things. And so I think that expecting posture is a proactive approach. So our Space ISAC Watch Center intends to be a 24/7 capability and do follow the sun. So we recently partnered with the UK Space Agency. We signed a formal MOU with them. We're talking to Taiwan Space Agency about partnering with them. We have already partnered with JAXA and METI in Japan, Greece. The Germans have signed with us. We're also signed with the Israel Space Agency, and we're talking to the Europeans about signing a partnership agreement with them, as well as NATO. So when you have all of these different parts of the world all working together to address space systems cybersecurity, how can you not be positive about that? We also have new technologies that we need to develop and workforce that we need to develop. So we did create a fellows program that's focused on cybersecurity, space, and intelligence. If anyone is interested in learning about how those three things come together, then feel free to talk to me, because there's great opportunities. Throughout the over 100 member companies that are in the Space ISAC, we need talent that understands that. We also need that in our Watch Center and in these other operational capabilities that will form over time around the world. So as you can tell, I'm very optimistic that we have a bright future. We just have some work to do.
Yeah, we definitely have some work to do, but I will echo one comment you made about the international nature of this, which is some of our greatest partners in the work that we're doing with the interagency has been the State Department, and that's because of the demand signal that we're seeing. Like when they go out and talk about space, the questions they get are, and what about cybersecurity? There's a lot of interest internationally in this topic as well, and that is why I think it's so important that we continue as government and industry to work on this problem and kind of set a model that we can help bring to our partners around the world, because there is a lot of interest. Mika, I mentioned at the outset that you are the principal author of the DoD Cyber Strategy that was released last year, and we're also hearing a lot about increased investments by the United States Space Force into cybersecurity. What are some of the key takeaways about how DoD is tackling cyber challenges to space systems in the strategy, and what should we expect from the department coming forward?
Yeah, so I think a lot more work to be done on cyber for space systems. Some of that we're not going to be able to discuss in this forum. But one of the things that's in the Defense Cyber Strategy that I think is relevant for this audience is an increased focus on cybersecurity for allies and partners. And as we've mentioned, we do a lot of cooperation with other countries in space. And so the US is going to have a national security interest in the cybersecurity of our allies and partners' cybersecurity. So we are talking with them all the time about ensuring that their systems are secure. But one of the things for especially those partners of ours that are operating space systems, right now we have a global technology ecosystem. But we have two nation states that have either expressed or demonstrated an interest in disrupting space systems, right? Viasat, we know who's done that. And then I would just note that the PRC has an information network electronic warfare strategy where they are thinking about disruption of those systems. So for those of you who are engaged in technologies where the cybersecurity conversation runs back through a Beijing office, ask yourselves, how incentivized are they to share threat information to those systems with you if the nation state in which they are located is the one interested in the disruption of the space systems? So I think that there is a really important question for our allies and partners, for US companies, as they think about the cybersecurity of space systems and vulnerability disclosure, in understanding who would be disclosing those vulnerabilities. Who is responding to that weird glitchiness that you're seeing in your system? Is that coming back to somebody who is commercially interested in ensuring that all vulnerabilities are closed? Or is that coming back to somebody who might be pressured to look the other way on a vulnerability? And so I think that there's some really important questions as we talk to allies and partners, which is a big part of the Defense Cyber Strategy, in being able to ensure that we are working with them to understand best practices for space cybersecurity.
Yeah, and I think that is really important point, especially as Aaron mentioned earlier, right? When you look at how people go through these exercises, eventually everyone has the aha moment that there's a geopolitical strategic context here around what they're in. And I think that your point on how do we look at that if you're a cybersecurity company is a really, really important question for the community to consider. So Manan, let's go to you. And how are things working? What are you striving for right now from an operator's point of view in the government? And I think, at least as importantly, you got a lot of folks from the cybersecurity community in the room. What do you need? What's on your list of things that will help make your job easier and the vital work you're doing to protect the systems that we all rely on every day more secure?
Yeah, so from NOAA's perspective, we're looking at it from the availability standpoint. So availability of data. My colleagues mentioned that the data sharing aspect with all of our international partners who are in this space as well. So in some cases, we are augmenting our information, and whether it's a global phenomenon. So augmenting our information from our satellites with our partners' satellites is a key thing. And also looking at the commercial sector to bring in some of the lessons learned from them, purchasing some of the data from them into our space where possible. So again, continuity for national critical infrastructure for us is providing the highly available data sets wherever possible and using it as a way to sort of augment some of the risk. From you audience, I think the key aspect is come work for NOAA. Take a look at some of the job openings that we have. We have a ton of cybersecurity openings. But more importantly, bring some of the industry lessons that you guys have learned over your careers and apply to the space systems for us. As Mika mentioned, the ground still remains a key asset for us to secure, and that is an increasingly challenging space as more and more technical advances are happening. Things like AI/ML, we're constantly seeing vectors where AI/ML is being utilized to increase some of the surface vectors that we have. So apply some of those knowledge that you learn on securing the commercial side, help us with those types of technologies, and where possible, inject some approach that we can mitigate some of these risks, right? Government tends to be a little bit slower in terms of adoption of technology. This is where we rely on the commercial sector to help us increase some of our pace of adoption, and this is where I need all of your help to sort of keep us secure as we move forward.
It's a great point, especially on the workforce. So yes, go work for NOAA, but also we recognize, I think one of the things, Tahara, that we heard back and forth from industry a great deal when we were out on the road was the challenges of finding people who know both cybersecurity and space operations. And actually, I've had a number of fascinating conversations with United States Space Force about how they're trying to build the cadre of space cyber operators to defend the national security missions they're responsible for. It's a very interesting challenge and one that as we work forward in the Office of the National Cyber Director, implementing our national cyber workforce and education strategy, trying to find the intersections where you need someone who's got domain experience in multiple domains. Those are critical people that we have to help develop. And also, sometimes bring in cyber people to a space organization and say, hey, we'll help you understand the operations, but bring some of your knowledge to us. So indeed, go work for NOAA. That's definitely a takeaway here. Tahara, let's finally wrap up with you, and then we'll take, we got a couple minutes for questions from the audience. If you want to start lining up because you got a burning question, jump on it. But Tahara, at the National Space Council meeting in December, kind of focused on international space partnerships, the vice president and the council brought up the idea of setting some minimum requirements for space systems. And it would be great to hear your perspectives on what more we can expect from the White House, from the broader interagency as our organizations work together with our colleagues on the National Security Council. And then I would also love to hear, kind of your take of some of the other big things that have come out this week at RSA from the cyber community and how you see those applying to the space ecosystem.
Yeah, so first I have to say, I'm not a cyber person, I'm a space person. And space people usually go to space conferences to talk to space people about space things. So, and I say that a lot because it's just true. So for those of you that are not into space, hi. And, and yes, please go over to NOAA. There's a place in space for all of you, so we'd love to have you. So to answer your question, Nick, National Space Council, the National Security Council, and the Office of the National Cyber Director are currently co-chairing an interagency space policy committee to work the December tasking from Vice President Harris. The phase one of our approach is to coordinate the development of minimum cybersecurity standards for ground, link, and on-orbit segments for U.S. federally procured national security and civil space systems. We plan to have these minimum standards out by this summer. Additionally, the same policy committee is working to develop a fulsome implementation plan for Space Policy Directive Number 5, which is the cybersecurity principles for space systems. This implementation plan will lay out specific interagency actions over a prescribed timeline. And as we do this, it is our plan to continue to engage with industry, because I think, as you heard from all of my co-panelists here, is that we don't do this without input from our industry. And it's critical for tackling all the challenges that we face. To answer the latter part of your question, I'm sure everyone is tracking that Department of State has released the United States International Cyberspace and Digital Policy Strategy, which Secretary Blinken announced here at RSA on Monday. It is a great contribution to U.S. interagency diplomacy. I've talked about the importance of space and international partnerships from the National Space Council perspective, and state strategy similarly shows the growing role that technology and technology policy play across all foreign policy issues. In addition to the 3 guiding principles and 4 action areas of action, state specifically calls out the importance of satellite communications as a critical capability to keep global communities connected. Our State Department colleagues play a key role in all the work that we've talked about here today, and they are actively working with allies and partners on enhancing space cybersecurity, and resilience and critical infrastructure security. Also, on Wednesday, our colleagues at CISA announced their exciting work to implement the Secure by Design initiative through a new voluntary pledge that builds on efforts to make sure baseline cybersecurity principles are implemented during the product design phase to reduce the number of exploitable flaws. The new Secure by Design pledge highlighted this week gives companies an opportunity to publicly commit to taking these principles seriously through concrete actions. Secure by Design concepts are, of course, translatable to addressing cyber threats to space systems deployed every day in the U.S. and international.
Thanks, Sahara. So before we get to questions, I have my mandatory RSA slide of key takeaways. So I think we've heard from our panelists why the United States government is so focused on space system cybersecurity as a challenge. If you listened to Secretary Blinken's speech on Monday, you heard him talk about how technology used to be something that you had someone in the conversation. When he started work a decade ago on a lot of these issues, he said, I needed a technologist in the room to tell me, hey, is there a tech angle here? And today, tech is at the core of the diplomatic work that we're doing. That includes cyber, and that includes space. And so the nexus of that is absolutely something that the United States government cares a lot about. And secondly, the reason we're here, right, we're coming to talk to industry because we need input from industry if we're going to solve the tough challenges that we spent the first 2/3 of the panel talking about. Something we're committed to, the Office of the National Cyber Director, something that the Department of Defense as the sector risk management agency, another great Washingtonianism for the defense industrial base sector, does a lot of outreach with. It's also something that our colleagues at CISA, they run the Oh boy, all right, Space Systems Critical Infrastructure Working Group, the SISIWIG, that is open for participation from industry partners to understand the unique challenges in this domain and ways that we can solve them together. So we hope you'll get involved, we hope you'll go work for NOAA and also help get them the tech that they need to keep them protected and watch this space from Washington as we advance the policy ball forward as well. Now let's take some questions, so fire away.
Hello. First of all, thank you all for coming to speak with us today. I've really appreciated it. My name is Rose. I'm an aerospace engineer at NSWCDD, or as Tahara said, a space person who normally goes to space things. But I've really appreciated coming here and seeing the cyber security aspect of what I do. And because you guys are all experts at understanding these policies, I was curious, based on your analysis of cyber threats in the space industry, what are the threat vectors that you see as the most dangerous to the integrity of our space systems, and what suggestions would you have to engineers like myself who are seeking to design more cyber secure spacecraft?
So on that, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that as we look at the different segments of space systems, ground, link, and on orbit, right, the easiest thing for a malicious actor to try and get into is the ground segment. So basic cybersecurity principles that apply to networks, secure by design, how you are engineering those things, how you are being able to do authentication on that ground segment network, really important because that's the most likely way. I think as you are looking at some of those other segments, right, ensuring that your communications links are encrypted, right, really important, because the authentication of the communications between the ground and the on-orbit links, really important. And then as we look at the on-orbit link, right, you've got to think about how are you hardening against the space conditions, just as a sort of that exist out there anyway. And then one of the things that we really worry about a lot in the Department of Defense as we talk to other countries around the world in terms of space norms is making sure that no one's doing debris-causing activities in space, given the risk to the global space systems if we were going to have a debris-causing incident in space. And that's something we are very concerned about and talk to other countries about all the time. I don't know how much engineering you can do around that, but something we're thinking about.
If you don't mind, can I add?
Yeah.
So depending on what company you work for as an aerospace engineer or government entity, then you may be able to receive the alerts that we share out of the Space ISAC. We share alerts on a very regular basis and have an analyst working group where they're giving threat briefings, and they're documenting the TTPs and APTs and countermeasures associated with the adversarial activity that we're aware of and sharing. So I'd be happy to connect you to that if you're interested.
I would be, thank you.
Great, another question?
Hi, I'm Dave. I've been going to this conference for probably about 25 years. The same time frame I've been doing space and cyber and intelligence. Ms. Miller, to your 10% of the assets that are in space. So my question to you is, I understand that, and I understand NSA is going to have a strong role in what's good and sufficient, but who judges the other 90%, whether their cyber posturing is sufficient?
That's a good question. I think that's partially up to debate, but not really, because the commercial companies that own the infrastructure, it's their responsibility. So if you talk to the C-suite, we ran a C-suite level exercise, and I think if I understand your question correctly, then they definitely take ownership of their systems and they take responsibility, and it's their bottom line that's at stake if the adversary can take out their systems. Of course, there is the policy and regulation side of the conversation, and the public interest aspect of space systems and our public dependency on space systems is a factor that's part of the conversation, because it's not just the commercial sector that makes all the decisions when it comes to this, but their bottom line is at stake. And so if no one else is asking them to do anything, they are concerned and they are taking interest. I hope that answers your question.
Can I just add to it? At the December National Space Council meeting, the task by Vice President Harris was for minimum cybersecurity standards for all U.S. systems. Our phase 1 is tackling the government contracted systems, but phase 2 will be for rest of commercial. So that's the 90% that you're talking about. So we will have some minimal standards for the rest.
And I'll just say one other thing on that, right? So I mentioned the National Security Memorandum that came out last week that says, here is our new critical infrastructure security and resilience policy. Space systems are critical infrastructure. One of the things that policy does is stand up, pursuant to legislation that Congress passed a couple years ago, CISA as the national coordinator for critical infrastructure security and resilience. One of the reasons that the policy exists as such, that we have this national coordinator, is to deal with areas of cross-sector risk, like space systems. So when you look at this new policy, if you need some, bedtime reading, it's only 40 pages or so long. It's got lots of acronyms, most of which I know. But it says that each of the sector risk management agencies need to look at risk in their sector and come up with a plan to mitigate it, including potential requirements for critical infrastructure owners and operators, and that CISA, as the national coordinator, needs to take that and turn it into a national plan to mitigate risk, including areas of cross-sector risk, and space is absolutely one of those areas that we expect to see highlighted in the work going forward. All right, we've got like 30 seconds, so a very quick question.
This is not a 30-second question.
All right, come ask us after. Thank you so much. I hope you'll join me in thanking our terrific panelists.